having an opportunity to affirm and to celebrate the lives, especially of older lesbians, is something that I find really beautiful and valuable. And I think there's something about the celebration, the affirmation, that is really beautiful and can be really beautiful in intergenerational connections and conversations that moves us beyond sort of what we can learn from one another. I take for granted that we will learn from one another and that we will value those lessons. But something that I think we can bring more regularly into our interactions is the celebration, the affirmation, the acknowledgement of the beauty of survival, the acknowledgement of the creativity of charting new paths.
Welcome to the Zami Nobla National Organization of Black Lesbians on Aging podcast. We are your sound source for Black lesbian herstory. I'm your host, Angela Denise Davis. This is a treat. It was recorded last year when we were doing a series on lesbian relationships. Our guests, Nikki Young and Benae Beamon, are also a year older. Nikki and Benae shared with us their journey of love and how they're moving in the world.
My name is Benae Beamon. I am a partner, a daughter, a sister, artist, scholar, and creator. I am 29.
My name is Nikki Young, and I am a partner, a parent, a cousin, a sister, a friend, a scholar, a teacher, and a really hopeful person. I'm 39.
Thank you for being part of our podcast, Nikki and Benae. It's such a pleasure to have you here. Tell me about the work you do in the world and how you came to understand that as being yours.
I came to religious studies as an undergraduate. I wasn't really planning on it, and I have been taking religious studies courses throughout all of my schooling, actually, because I went to Catholic school, so I thought I was sort of leaving it behind when I went to undergrad at Colgate University, but was just fascinated. I think fascinated by the meaning-making systems that we constitute as individual human beings and as individual human beings in community with others, and the ways in which our belief systems allow us to change our actions. And so I continued studying religion. And actually now it seems at times that my work is less about religion and religious studies in the sort of traditional way that people might think about and conceive of it, because I focus so heavily on religion or spirituality and spiritual discourse in Black communities. And I think that spirituality and religion are so interwoven into the everyday life and lives of Black people. They are written into the art forms that Black people have constituted, right? You can't think of John Coltrane's Love Supreme and not think there's a kind of religiosity and a depth to that work. I think about it every time I think about tap dance, for sure, right? That is an art form that was searching for and found possibility in a world that made Black existence and Black joy seem impossible.
When did you start tap dancing?
I started tap dancing when I was really young. I was probably about 3, but I didn't really start investing in the culture of tap dance and the history and the real, I think, powerful weight for me of tap dance until I was in high school.
Wow. So how did you get started? Did you see somebody was tap dancing and decided you wanted to do that? Or what led you to it?
My mom tells this story a lot. I was a very hyperactive child and easily distracted. And we went to see Alvin Ailey. And she and my sister had planned to take shifts in a sense, right? Who would take me out when I started getting distracted and making too much noise. And I sat through the whole performance and even the intermission just staring at the stage, totally spellbound. And that's when she put me in dance, and it's been one of my greatest passions since then. And I think I've come to it in new ways, sort of consistently and regularly throughout my life. I've learned new things or found myself in new and exciting capacities since then, I would say.
What about you, Nikki? How did you find yourself doing the work you're doing?
I feel like this is such an interesting question that I'm asked over and over in different ways. And I find myself making up something each time. So I think this time I'm just going to try to lean into what feels the most honest right now today. And it has to do with what we're doing right now, which is capturing stories. I've always been really interested in my family's stories and watching my mom and aunts and cousins sit around and share the really hilarious things that have happened in their lives and the really difficult things that are told through hilarious vignettes even. But because there's something about gaining the information of getting the history of what happened, but there's also the deep meaning making, the stories underneath the stories that I was always interested in. And they taught them lessons, the stories did. They illustrated their decision making. They sort of painted a contextual picture for all of us to understand what their experiences were. So those stories kind of acted like a broad frame for me to make sense of my family's history. And I think that broad frame for me turned into, I mean, I didn't know this then, but a sort of system of ethics. Right. So like what seems right and wrong in this space, not in the larger Black culture, in the larger, state of South Carolina or in the United States or in the world, but in my family at this time, given these circumstances, what felt good and right. And I think always being interested in that has been a foundation to why I study and think the way I do. So when I went to college, I was interested in being a doctor. I come from a town where the only ideas of success was were a doctor, a lawyer, or a business owner. And so, I went to college and I was like, well, I'm inclined to want to help people. I want to make moves in the world that are beneficial for the community. And while I was in college, I realized that I had a sort of scientific mind. I was interested in quantitative stuff, but the kinds of questions that I asked were about how and who and why. They were qualitative questions. And I think discovering that, having the opportunity to reflect on the way that I'm engaging the world, my curiosity about the world is qualitative. It's about the sort of meat underneath, was really helpful. And so I decided, all right, I'm not going to go to medical school. I mean, my grades decided, whatever, choose. But I decided I'm not going to go to medical school, but I should follow up on some of these questions. So I went to seminary and I was like, okay, maybe there's a possibility that my help in the world will come through ministry. I probably was in seminary for a week when I was like, okay, yeah, I'm not called to that. That's not who I am, but I do want to talk about this stuff. And while I was there, it was probably maybe the first or second semester when I said to myself that I was a scholar. I was the curiosity meant that I wanted to think and talk and write, and that's what I did. And so I put those things together with those original curiosities about context and history and ethical systems, and realized like, oh, what I want to be is an ethicist. And I want to ask questions, not about what people ought to be doing, but about what people are doing and how that can teach us about the world that we live in. And I think that sort of orients me now. It shapes the way that I ask questions in my scholarship or the ways that I show up. But it comes out everywhere. It's not just in my professional life. It's in the dinner that we have with friends, and we're pursuing questions that are ethical. So I think the stories that shape us are a part of my foundation.
Now that we've talked about your work, let's talk about your relationship. How did the two of you meet?
Well, we're both ethicists, and we study like almost exactly the same thing. My work is on Black queer folks in general in religious ethics, in Christian ethics, but I'll say like Christian social ethics. I'll say broadly ethics. But Benae does the same thing. And we happened to be at an academic institute one summer. And I had previously gone through the institute and returned to I think maybe give a talk or something. And I met Benae there.
Yeah, we met there, and I was very familiar with Nikki's work. So, we do very similar work. I think my work is really informed by Nikki's work and some risks I think she took in ethics. And my dissertation that I'm writing right now focuses on Black trans women and understandings of sexuality and gender in Black Christian religious spaces and how it impacts Black trans women, and the lived ethic that Black trans women have created. And how that is a really helpful, rich, incredible model for thinking about sexuality, gender, and the world we live in, and how to better support one another. And in addition to that, I do some work around Black artistic expression and the ethical value of Black artistic expression. So, but I don't think that work will be possible without some of the examples that I've seen in Nikki's work. So I was very aware of her work and really excited to meet her at this institute. And she, the very generous scholar that she is, I think she brings some like Black queerness to the way that she practices scholarship. She doesn't see it as a competitive practice, but an opportunity to support and lift and mentor other scholars. So her being the generous scholar that she is, was like, oh, I'd love to work with you. And we started working on a project together, which was a really exciting experience.
It was really fun. We worked on a paper together that was about the performance of Black death in the public sphere as protests, right? So the die-ins basically framed a paper that we wrote together, and we talked about what those die-ins symbolized and why the use of Black bodies in those spaces cultivated an image of Black death as a sort of resource. And but it was really fun to work together, and it was in the working together that we also developed a friendship. And, crushes happen. And I think we developed crushes on one another and just we became friends. And then eventually we admitted that we liked each other.
Explain what a die-in is. What is that?
A die-in was a protest. I don't actually think it's quite as popular right now.
I don't think so.
Or as regular, I should say, not popular. But particularly in 2000, I would say between 2014 and 2016.
Maybe 13 to 15 too.
Yeah. So maybe we say 2013 to 2016 in that range, particularly after Mike Brown, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, right? The sort of flurry of Black deaths at the hand of police brutality. Though we could talk about how extensive that conversation in itself could be. But when we were sort of inundated by way of media around even, right, we could add the names Freddie Gray. People were laying down in the streets or in spaces. So I know at a large conference, there was a die-in. So people will lay their bodies down for a set amount of time. And that was sort of the die-in, right? There is no discourse. There are no chants in the same way that we might see with a rally or a march. And there's no movement in the way that we might see with a rally or a march, but there's still that sort of disruption of public space.
And there's the visual reminder of the sort of massiveness of death as a space taker and as a reminder of what these deaths actually look like when we confront them. So the die-ins have multiple purposes that include disruption, but also a hypervisualization of something that people can and have been ignoring consistently. And so we wrote about the way that ritual draws on some histories, and it also produces and promotes a kind of ethical system that may or may not be the best for us. So not that the protests are good or bad, but that they create a context that at least calls our attention to evaluate.
For the same purpose that you explained die-ins, what is theological ethics and why is it so important?
I think This is such a good question that even ethicists have trouble answering, I think. And here's what I would say broadly. It's a combination of thinking about God and the divine and what our meaning making of God's presence, what impact that has on the ways that we relate to one another. Or for some people who are about, shaping what we're supposed to do, it's about how meaning making about God ought to inform how we interact with one another. So for me, what that translates into is not, in fact, listening to what God says and then determining what I'm supposed to do. Instead, it's asking the question, how or in what ways is God showing up in these interactions? And what ways can we relate to one another that bring about our best life, our most collective, our most beautiful collective and individual flourishing? Like, that's what it means for me. For some of my colleagues, it definitely might mean, what does the Bible say and how does that impact what we ought to do? How does it shape our laws? But that's not my style.
This interview is part of a series of conversations with lesbian couples. Talk to us a little bit about the models of relationship you've seen in your lives and how that has informed the way in which you all live together as a couple.
One of the most formative things that have happened in my life is the interview process for my dissertation, which eventually turned into my book. And I learned that Black queer people, but in particular Black women and Black lesbians, have a set of a variety of values that inform how they ought to interact. And I think these are values that we can all learn from. And so some of the things that I saw Black lesbians doing were things like expecting not reciprocity, but a kind of deep mutuality, right? The notion that you could expect love rather than simply sacrifice is hugely different than the ways that our broader society shapes the way love should look like. In an average conversation, someone will somewhere explain that love ought to be self-sacrificial, right? It comes from, there are lots of sources that it comes from, and in a Christian context, it's sort of the way that we talk about God even. And so the value of Mary, right, is a self-sacrificing thing. The mother or the grandmother is the best because she gave all she had. And there was something so profound when I was interviewing Black lesbians about the expectation of a love that returns, a love that generates, that produces, and that produces in a space that people share, that I was like, oh, absolutely. Why wouldn't the highest thing that we aspire to be that we not only give, but we are able to receive? So then the other values are things like vulnerability and what it means to distinguish between, Black lesbians being able to distinguish between a kind of unconditional love that's meaning you can act any kind of way you want and I'll love you anyway, which could be dangerous and abusive, to a love without condition, meaning the love that I have is not based on some set of acts that you do, but on a belief in who you are. And I think that's really beautiful and different. This is hard to say because it's being recorded, but I don't know that there are a lot of examples in my life of relationships to which I aspire. But there are a lot of examples of people loving themselves and one another in ways that I really want to emulate and that I want to learn from. And it's hard to say that that hasn't always shown up in relationships.
Mm-hmm. I would actually agree with that. I don't know that I, in my life, have lots of examples of relationships to which I aspire. And I think that is problematic in some ways and really freeing in other ways. It's one of the things that I love and value most about being in a Black queer relationship, which is that I feel there are zero limitations. I don't feel bound by gender roles in the way that some people might feel in other relationships. I don't feel bound by social and societal expectations. So I think we have the freedom to construct our relationship in lots of different ways and to have it look whatever way suits us best. And I've found that it's been of like deep value to us as two people relating to one another.
And I think, not to interrupt you, but I think to add to what you're saying, that we are accountable in a different way to elements of our relationship because we name and create them. So there aren't as many, and I'm not saying that there are none. I mean, we are a part of the world, but there aren't as many unspoken scripts that operate. And so that means when we're naming, sort of the standard of operation in the household, I don't know why I went corporate, but anyway, when we're naming the things, we're accountable to something that we named rather than accountable to things that we're just taking for granted. And that does feel freeing. It feels more honest, but it does take a lot of work. It takes a lot more work to be honest and accountable than it does to fall in line or ride the waves that are already going, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I don't know that I've definitely learned from people around me and family members what it means to love oneself, what it means to be generous and compassionate in the world. And I will also say what I think it means to do all of those things while being Black, which I think is a particular orientation. But I've also learned it from music and art that I've explored. Like I'm thinking right now about of Donny Hathaway singing Young, Gifted, and Black, right? Is a particular orientation, a particular way of approaching a conversation and a sense of self. I'm thinking of Nina Simone singing, is it I Got Life, right? Thinking of her own embodiment, right? Naming the things that she has and has ownership over, naming her own agency in that way. Like those have been lessons to me, I think, as well, about what it means to be a fully formed self, which I think is also necessary and important in relation to another person.
I think that that's true because it also gives us an opportunity for humility. And I mean humility in terms of like seeing ourselves in relation to another, right? Or seeing ourselves in relation to God, if that's how we describe God, right? So there is something about the music, and I'm glad that you're bringing that up, that reminds me of how when Benae and I are engaged in something really important in our life or some special moves, we go to music. And here lately, we go to specific gospel songs, and there are times when theologically we're like, ooh, I don't know. And then there are other times when simply the spirit behind the music is enough. And that creativity and that expression moves us. It reminds us of values. It gives us hope and it shapes joy. And then we bring it into our really queer rituals that we do.
Well, that prompts me to ask you, what's the music that's currently on your CD player? What are you listening to?
Well, the record that's in front is
John Coltrane.
It's John Coltrane. It's like always, it's usually right in front. And if it's not that one, it's the Miriam Makeba is usually right behind that.
Miriam Makeba.
We do listen to a lot of Sam Cooke for another set of reasons.
I would say James Booker is on there, which is like pure Black innovation. It's amazing. I would say Sun Ra too. It's often on the turntable.
There's a lot of reggae music in the house that ranges from old school reggae to, I mean, it's mostly old school. I mean, we don't really listen to a lot of dance hall or anything, and that's different anyway. But what we call roots reggae would be on there, somebody who's like Dennis Brown to, and then you hear like Peter Tosh somewhere. I mean, really a broad variety of musics. And then we might wake up and someone has put on Fela and it's making breakfast. But then on our phones or our Spotify, most often played, if you look at both of our phones, is a gospel playlist that's got like, Fred Hammond on there. You might hear the Clark sisters. I mean, so the soundtrack of our life is very Black, and there's a real range of creativity and joy, or creativity in a variety of emotional expressions. That's really beautiful for us.
Or just last night we were listening to like some Santeria by Celia Cruz, which is also great.
Yeah. Benae has really taken a turn towards Celia Cruz, and it's a big part of our life right now.
I like intergenerational conversations because one of the things I think is so important to highlight is the fact that we've not always lived in a space where Black lesbians could be out and about doing work, living lives, and certainly you all doing your work and living your lives, and other younger lesbians now and lesbians in general who have taken the space to do that. It's just very powerful and profound to see how we're present in the world. How important are these opportunities for intergenerational conversation for the two of you?
I mean, I think it's super important, and not just for the learning element. I mean, I certainly think that we can all learn from each other, and that that's beautiful. But there's something else which is about affirming people's lives. And I think having an opportunity to affirm and to celebrate the lives, especially of older lesbians, is something that I find really beautiful and valuable. And that for younger lesbians, the cheering on of your choices, the pride in you having made different or difficult decisions, not by virtue of just being lesbian, but by virtue of choosing to change scripts. And I think there's something about the celebration, the affirmation, that is really beautiful and can be really beautiful in intergenerational connections and conversations, that moves us beyond sort of what we can learn from one another. I take for granted that we will learn from one another and that we will value those lessons, but something that I think we can bring more regularly into our interactions is the celebration, the affirmation, the acknowledgement of the beauty of survival, the acknowledgement of the creativity of charting new paths. And yeah, I'm excited about that part.
Yeah, I'm excited about it as well. I think the most base level, what it means to see yourself and your community projected into the future, is to see a capacity for survival, right? Is to see your own kind of possibility. But also, I think I'm also certainly at a time in my life where I'm really hungry for knowledge. And that's knowledge that I feel that in every sense of the word. Celia Cruz has been playing a lot in our house, in part because I have an obsessive personality at times, and I'm hungry for information as I think about Afro-diasporic expressions. I'm hungry for information about my family. I'm hungry for information about Black history, Black cultural production, and I think this is part of that excitement and enthusiasm.
So if we were to create a space today where we were in the presence of an older Black lesbian or an older Black lesbian couple in their 80s or 90s, what type of questions would you have for her or for them?
What brings you joy? What things do you do? How do you relate to the people around you that gives you the most joy? And what are you proud of in terms of how you show up in other people's lives? I think that would be one of the first questions that I would ask. I'm not sure. What about you?
Tell me who you are and how you've come to be that person.
Yeah. And then I might ask some things like, what sort of movies do you watch? I'm interested in how do you spend your time? Do you think about your life primarily in terms of your lesbian experience? Are there other things that sort of shaped the narrative of your life in a different way? But yeah, but also like, what do you watch? What are you listening to? What's informing your understanding of the world right now versus when you were 50 versus when you were 30?
I would like to believe that we are leaving that type of information for lesbians who in the future will look back and want to know in 2019 what were Black lesbians doing. The ones who are 29 and 39, the ones who are 90 and 60 and 45, to have an archive of information so that younger women don't have to search for information about who we are, certainly as a Black lesbian community, and who they can be based upon just the wealth of the history of our experiences. So, Nikki and Benae, thank you so much for being part of our Black lesbian history.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
It's been a real honor, and I'm glad to be in conversation always with my partner. And wonderful to be in conversation with you.
I just love talking with Black lesbians, especially those who are showing out in so many fierce and formative ways. Thank you, Nikki and Benae, for a great conversation. One that I hope makes us think more about what we leave, what we create, and how we are really connected in community. And thank you for listening to the podcast today. As always, I want to encourage you to leave a comment or feedback about the podcast wherever you listen to the Zami Nabla podcast, and want to encourage you to share a link with a friend about the work that we are doing. Be safe, be well, be creative. And as always, have a sweet one.